These are dark times. For some of us, they always have been. Yet there is resilience in our places, wisdom in our streets, the desire to resist, to care, to be together again. We can harness this critical moment. Our stories of ruin, resistance, and renewal will light the way forward. Join us at the SF Urban Film Fest.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th annual SF Urban Film Fest. My name is Darmawi and I'm the founder and executive director. Our mission is to use film to inspire conversation and action around urban issues. In addition to Crystal, who I'll bring on the stage in a moment, our team includes Ron Sundstrom, Humanities Advisor, and program producers Robin Abad, Omid Menacheri, and Susanna Smith. I would also like to give a shout out to our marketing guru, Hannah Moore, and also to our volunteers. I want to bring Crystal on.
And I am Crystal Chelik, Festival Manager. We hope you've had the chance to watch the film Rebuilding Paradise, directed by Ron Howard, which provides important context for this conversation. If you have not watched it yet, you still have time with your all access pass through the website, your rental pass, which is sliding scale. And Faye will intro the program.
Thanks, Crystal. And thank you everyone so much for joining us today for the Rebuilding Paradise panel discussion. Our panel program will begin in a few moments, but first a few announcements. We would like to offer a land acknowledgement. Thank you so much, Ron W. Goode, for guiding us on this land acknowledgement. As the SF Urban Film Fest is based in the Bay Area, we acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who were the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As this program is about a film on the rebuilding of the town of Paradise, California, we acknowledge that that region is on the ancestral homeland of the Maidu and Miwok peoples. We are presenting this land acknowledgement to promote visibility for the Ramaytush Ohlone, the Maidu and Miwok peoples, and all American Indians living and thriving today on their ancestral homelands.
We're all getting used We're all getting used to navigating virtual events, so unpredictable things may happen. Thanks for your patience, and if you have any issues at any point, please leave a message in the comment box. We wanted to let you know that today's program is being recorded and give a thank you to our members joining us today. If you'd like to keep our community growing and become a member, it's easy to do so via our website. Our festival this year is Pay What You Can so that all can access our programs. Any size donation will help. Simply donate via the donate link you'll find in the chat box. Please also fill out our quick survey that we'll drop in the chat. It's important that we get as many survey responses as possible so that we can understand who we're reaching and make sure we can best serve our diverse and wonderful audiences. And now to our program. Faye, take it away.
I'm very honored and excited to moderate the panel today. As the wildfires rage this fall in Northern California and the skies turn orange around me in San Francisco, my mind raced to trace all the possible reasons why we have found ourselves in this situation again. From climate change, extreme drought, extreme heat, to development at urban edges, to our relationship with the land. Simply put, the entire way we live must be re-examined. That's why I'm so excited to have our esteemed panelists here today. I'm going to introduce them briefly by their name and their title. Their full bios are available on their website. I also want to introduce and invite onto the stage Ron W. Goode. He's the tribal chairman of the North Fork Mono Tribe and Educator. I'd also like to invite on the stage Sarah Karlinsky. She's a senior advisor at SPUR. I'd also like to invite San Parker. She's a producer on the film Rebuilding Paradise. I'd also like to invite Kevin Phillips, the Paradise Town Manager, onto the stage. And as a reminder, throughout the discussion, please submit your questions in the chat function on YouTube or Facebook. Okay, so as moderator, let me set the context a little bit. So the town of Paradise is approximately 175 miles northeast of San Francisco and is located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. In November 2018, the campfire raged for 17 days, displacing 50,000 people from Butte County and killing 85. The state of California has spent billions for cleanup and rebuilding since then. I want to start the panel discussion by first asking Kevin Phillips, as Paradise's town manager, can you tell us what happened in Paradise since the campfire in 2018 in terms of rebuilding?
Sure. Thank you, Faye. Thank you, all of the panelists for being here, and then all that are online watching. Thanks for being here. This is a very important story and obviously very close to my heart. So in November of 2018 was the worst day of Paradise's history. That day took over about 16,000 structures in the town of Paradise, destroying most of the businesses and displacing all of the residents. And after that, there has been a lot of tremendous positive stuff going on here in Paradise. Being that we had one bad day, it's been taking quite a few days to actually recover from that. So one of the first things that we did as a town was to basically create a plan. And that plan was citizen driven. So looking at all of the individuals that were displaced, knowing that their town had been destroyed, and all of them wanting the town to come back. But how was that town going to come back and to be driven by those individuals that were here before the fire? And a lot of it was based around safety. And so what we did was we took this long-term recovery plan that had multiple items in there, including hardening of houses, widening of roads for evacuation routes, alert systems, knowing that you watch the film, a lot of it was about getting information out to those citizens here. And we've ran with that. So we're in the process of putting in an earlier alert system here in town. We're actually in the process of looking at all of our roadways and road paths to see where it would be best to be spent so that there's evacuation routes. that are wide enough to evacuate the citizens in a safe manner. We're looking at undergrounding all of the utilities within the town of Paradise to make sure that there's no obstructions for those people to come back. And then we're looking, basically the biggest struggle, and the biggest struggle from the after the fire was getting all the debris out. All of this debris that was burnt, which was majority of it was houses, but we were also very forested up here, and so those trees were also damaged too. So trying to get all of those trees and all of that out. The other thing that we're doing is we're partnering with other agencies now, looking at our borders, and we're working with the Parks Department up here, and we're working with the National Forest of looking at putting in buffers around the town to create a safer part, so that when these fires start, 18, 20 miles away out of town, and as they're raging towards our town, that we actually have a buffer system to stop those fires. So we're looking at becoming a more resilient, a safer community, and that a community that can welcome our residents back, but also knowing that some of those residents aren't going to come back after the fire, and trying to rebuild with those new individuals coming up, that we have a more safe and more resilient town for them to come back into.
Thanks, Kevin. How many people have come back to the town?
So after the fire, there was approximately 15,000 or 1,500 structures that remained, and most of those are occupied. And currently, we have pulled 1,500 building permits. And that's not really a 2-year basis; it's more of a 1-year basis, because it took about a year to get, like I said, all the debris out for people to actually make plans to come back and rebuild on their property. So 1,500 building permits in a 1 year or 1.5 year cycle. We're very happy with those numbers, and we see the trends continuing to move forward, that people are making a decision to come back. So we're very, very happy with that.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that. Personally, and as part of the SF Urban Film Fest, we remember that fire because we were actually having a film festival that November 2018, and we had to basically shut down for the fire. So we're so happy to hear that your town is back on the path of recovery. So I'm going to turn it to San. So since the film, and since your time there, the wildfires continue to rage in California. Obviously, last September we had many fires. So I'm sure the film is still being circulated as we've been screening on our festival. What has there been continued reaction to the film, and also what are your personal reactions to having been there during that fire?
Well, I think that the film is being seen through a few different lenses now that, we couldn't have predicted. One is that it was a particularly bad fire season, and the other is that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So all of us are living through something that we're challenged by, and we're relying on the communities around us and on resources in a way that we haven't had to in the past. And that has brought up a lot of interesting discussion. I think that when people watch the film in the context of a bad fire season, they are calling out things and discussions about it, like climate change and land management and, so many other big issues that affect us all. But, where we usually like to point, what we usually like to point out is to focus on the trauma, because by understanding the trauma that is caused to people and communities, you can understand what climate change feels like, or what this kind of disaster feels like. And that's, I think, very easy for people to relate to.
So that's really something that I also felt watching the film. There was so many emotions that were elicited when watching the film. Can you talk a little bit about how the use of film perhaps is a way for people to kind of understand the trauma more?
Yeah, actually, we were very inspired by reading the work of this Australian environmental philosopher, Glenn Albrecht, and he coined the term solastalgia, and he developed that when he was studying the effect on Aboriginals of, not so much loss of their home, because in many ways, a lot of Aboriginals are in the same places where their communities have been for many years, but their environments have been completely transformed. So they're homesick for the home that they're in. And that is what happens when this kind of trauma is brought into a community's life. And it's just like a universal trauma and suffering. And I think that film allows you to tell a story about people or a person, and the audience engages with stories, they engage with narratives, they engage with characters, and documentary allows a person to really believe and engage in like the authenticity of what's being said and what's being told. And then you can get at like the emotional suffering that comes along with, what's very visual, of course, are the fires. And that's the way our film starts out, and the damage that's done, and then the repairs that are happening and the restoration that's happening. But cinema, because you're in this linear experience that's time-based, it can really bring home what that's like to try to recover from that.
Yeah, so I'm going to put a pin on that. We're going to come back to that. That's a very, very important point. We're getting already some questions about it, but I want to ask Sarah Karlinsky from SPUR, juxtaposed with what Zan is talking about, which is sort of like the emotional, personal story. You work at a urban planning think tank, so you have the sort of like bigger picture. How do you balance sort of the on the ground lived experience with sort of thinking about the larger policy issues? So what are some of the key questions we need to be asking when we're approaching these questions of rebuilding?
Yeah, well, first I just want to start off by thanking you for putting together this film festival and also this panel. I think it's really, it's very timely and very important. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I have my brother-in-law and sister-in-law and their 2 children live in Austin, Texas, and they just went through 84 hours with freezing cold and no heat and no electricity, and their pipes burst and their neighbors' pipes burst, and it's a scary time for them. And so just these disasters, these climate disasters, are going to continue to happen, and we're going to need to grapple with them. So I just appreciate getting to talk about this. I think in terms of the questions that we at SPUR think about, there are 3 related to rebuilding. The first is, where should we be rebuilding? The second is, what should be rebuilding? And the third is, who decides? And I know we're going to probably have a lot of conversations about this, and it's not just about Paradise, it's about many places. And when we're thinking about where we should be rebuilding, I just want to bring us to a point in the movie that I found very compelling. It was a small moment, and it's when the assembly member who represents Paradise, James Gallagher, is in a hearing room, and a fellow assembly member is asking, should we be rebuilding in places like Paradise that are vulnerable to wildfires? And the assembly member Gallagher responds, we don't ask that question. We're talking about downtown San Francisco. And I just was really taken by that. I thought it was a really important point because it just speaks to the conundrum of how we think about where we should rebuild. Downtown San Francisco is incredibly vulnerable to earthquake risk. And part of the research that I personally have done is around this idea of earthquake risk. But of course, there's also wildfire risk in California. There's hurricane risks in other parts of the country. There's flooding risks and sea level rise risks. And the number of these risks and the types of these risks are only going to increase due to climate change. And so the places that we think about as being dangerous are also going to be, they're going to increase. Are we not going to rebuild downtown Manhattan the next time there's a major hurricane? Well, the answer to that is probably no. Of course we are going to rebuild. So when you start thinking about that, you start thinking about, well, why some places we're like, oh, of course we'll rebuild, and others, we have this question about, ought we rebuild? And it's just hard to get underneath what's under that question and think about it. So I think just one point on this where that I want to bring up is that I think when we're thinking about risk, it's pretty easy to say, oh, if there's significant risk that's going to be recurring, then maybe we don't newly build in certain places. But for vulnerable places where people do live right now, the answer is just going to be much trickier, and one that I think as a society we're going to need to be grappling with. The second question about what should we be rebuilding is a really important one, and I feel like Kevin talked about it in his opening remarks, and something we've been thinking about a lot. We did a report called On Solid Ground that sort of is all about this. And we worked on that report with a guy who helped with rebuilding of Santa Cruz after the Loma Prieta earthquake, when downtown Santa Cruz was just completely flattened. And he talked a lot about this idea of the first plan. People have an idea in their mind of what they want to rebuild, and it's what was there before. And that is the first plan. But when you're thinking about disaster mitigation, you might want to be thinking more about like what's going to help a town be more resilient in the future. And so there might be certain portions of the town, that you might say we don't want to rebuild in, or there might be different ways of rebuilding, fire hardening or other things that are thought about. But one of the most important things that we found is that it's important to think about like how you want your town to be built and how you want your places to be built before any disaster occurs, before people are so upset, before there's so much anxiety. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, there's this question of who should decide what gets built and what doesn't. As I understand it, there's a point in every disaster recovery where there's like a spigot of federal money that gets turned on, and cities need to be prepared for that. And there's a point actually in the film, and Kevin, I'm sure, can speak to it more, where there's these really heart-wrenching discussions about how to prepare for the federal money, and do you need to basically remove fire damaged buildings before we can receive the money, and people were getting really, really upset about some of those types of questions. And so in that instance, it's the federal government, the conditions on their money informed some of the choices. And then at the local level, there's a question of representation. Who represents the community? How do you represent community members that have left but may return? How do you think about some of those issues? So I'll just stop there, but those are the three questions we really think about.
That's great. Yes, huge questions. Also the question of equitable rebuilding. Who is prioritized in the rebuilding? It can't be just everyone gets rebuilt equally at the same time. As a society, we kind of pick and choose who gets priority, and it seems like there's a huge sort of racial and people who are more vulnerable sort of get left behind and sort of get lost. I know that the rebuilding of New Orleans, for example, Ward 9 is still in shambles. That's a primarily African-American neighborhood in New Orleans. So thinking about who we prioritize in our rebuilding, it's really important to me, and I think important to everyone listening today. So I want to turn it to Ron Goode. So thank you so much for being here today. You've been working to change the way we live in Northern California, the way we relate not only to wildfire management, but to the way that we relate to the land and to each other in general. Can you give us some impressions or wisdom on the situation?
Sure. Thank you again for inviting me, and Manahu to everybody. I think, to reiterate on what all the great panelists are speaking on, and we did a nice acknowledgement. So start there with the fact that, these Native folks, Indigenous folks, Native Americans, Indians have been on this land for 8,000 to 10,000 years, if not longer. They endured many, many catastrophic endeavors, from droughts to global warmings to fires to pandemics. And yet survived and thrived. So that's an important factor. When we move to, let's say, thinking in terms of how do we address, or do we address making things safer, we must first understand that what that means. So just like in the creek fire down here, using Shaver Lake as an example, it was saved, it was defendable in a couple of places. It was defendable on the north side because the Southern California Edison people had practiced their management plan and kept the land open. And so folks were able to come in and move the fire away from the town. The fire also recircled on the west side and could have gone up the drainage to the township. But private landowners had been working in that area for quite some time, and they had their land defendable. Now, what does that mean? So in the terms of wildfire, it doesn't matter if you've worked on the land, if you even have the land appropriately thinned, that fire is still coming. Well, in the case of the private landowners, it burned the land that they had extensively cleared. But because when it hits that part of the land, then it becomes controllable, and then was not allowed to reach the areas that were not thinned like it should have been. And that's the really key issue of when you're looking at your landscape of what you want. And I think, Kevin hit it right on the head. Was this is a forest area. People move there because it's a forest area. The native folks have lived there for thousands and thousands of years because it is forest. But how do you then make it defendable? How do you make it to the point to where you have to understand that it's still going to burn? And when you go pre-1850 with the Indian people here in California, they didn't have cars, they didn't have a horse, they didn't have fire engines, but they had fire themselves as a tool. And so they were able to use that to create a broader space in all of their village areas where they lived, where they camped, and most importantly, their trails, their routes of where they hunted, the routes of their movement, how they were going to move from one place to another. And it's good to hear, what Kevin was saying about the looking at how to get out, because when we watched the film, that was the major one of the major key points was that, all of a sudden people were gridlocked, couldn't move. And when you're in smoke, you can't see where you're going. You have no clue to where you're going. And so that's a really good issue that they are now addressing. But back with the native people, when we talk about clearing trails, you can't think of it as, where you walked. You have to think of it as a corridor. And because when a wildfire comes and you need to leave your village and move to another area, so does every other animal that's living there with you. Bears, deer, wolves, coyotes, snakes. They all walking along with you. They all trying to get out too, right? So this is kind of what happens when we think in terms of where we live today and how we like the ambiance that we're at, and that's why we moved there. I'm got a lot of friends up in the mountains, and some of them are new to the mountains, and they're very proud of the pine tree growing up next to their window, and they're very proud of the cedar tree growing up through their deck. But the reality is when a wildfire comes, that's what's going to burn. And so you have to push further back out and make sure that, and I think we had this discussion earlier, maybe it's going to come up pretty soon, Faye, but in terms of, the fire that traveled, 14, 18 miles from some other place. Well, what about all those ranchers? What about all the governmental agencies that have land out there? They too have to have this responsibility and thought process of not only just taking care of themselves, but taking care of those that might be affected. So I'll stop for a moment.
That's a good segue to one of the questions that we just got from the audience members about the responsibility of utility companies. This question is obviously going to come up. So here's a question from our audience member. What are the expectations of the panel regarding the actions legislators and other officials should take to ensure utilities achieve wildfire mitigation and climate change adaptation outcomes?
Yeah, I guess I could start with trying to answer that question. So with this fire, PG&E was held accountable for the fire. I don't know how accountable that truly is, but it was proven that they were the cause of the fire, and the cause of the fire was because of the faulty power lines and the lack of maintenance on those power lines that created the fire. Again, we're talking about this huge animal that we're trying to control, this huge monopoly of the power system that we're trying to control, to get them up to speed to where they're not going to be starting these fires again. And to be honest, their response to it has been, well, when there's fire conditions, we'll just shut the power off. And I don't think that's the right response. I think the right response is to get their system up to speed so that it's hardy enough to adapt to our current climate change model that we're looking at. And so that's the issue. And then it comes to cost, right? Nothing's for free. So we're getting higher rates and higher utility bills that are being passed on because of their lack of maintenance through the last 50 years. Well, lack of maintenance over 50 years doesn't get changed in 2 years or 1 year. And climate change is happening faster than anybody's ever seen. And we're seeing wildfires that are 100, 200-year wildfires that are happening every year now. For the last 3 years, we've seen these wildfires that are out of control. So that's a great question. I think it does take legislation. I think it does take public pressure. I think it takes people really monitoring those companies, those monopolies, to make sure that they're doing what is quote unquote is right, and that the money that is being paid for by the customer is being actually put into use to protect those towns and those communities that are most vulnerable.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, this is also the issue in Texas, right? The big monopoly utility company sort of doing whatever it wants, taking $500 million in profits and not putting it back into weatherization. We have private utility monopolies in America. Why is that? I think that other panelists want to chime in, perhaps, on this issue. Zan, did you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, PG&E has had its fair share of transgressions in the state of California. And every time that their reparations, if you will, are allowed to be delayed or are argued against, or more leniency is given to them because they are a big, public company that, is important to the economy of the state, that just piles on, their responsibility in California for many disasters and for the pain of many, many communities. And I think we need corporate accountability, and we can speak about monopolies, but corporations need to be accountable to their customers and the communities that they live in. And that also applies to timber companies, other kinds of corporations. It's not just the utility that started this fire. It's the timber companies that were managing the land, the private companies managing the land all around. And it also applies to the public sector. And I think that if people are compelled by the pain that they see represented, the individual level pain that people see represented in our film, I hope that they think about that when they go to the ballot box. Because, if we keep allowing the freedom of these corporations to do these things, it really does come home to roost.
Clearly. Sarah, did you want to say?
No, I'll pass on this one.
Okay. Ron?
Yeah, just, again, Kevin really hit it good because every time that there is a problem with PG&E, then we as the public pay for it, so no matter how much they get sued, then our rates go up, and our rates are supposed to go up again, and it just keeps going up and up. So that brings us to individuals that somehow, and legislation that somehow or another, if solar might be one of those answers. I personally have not invested in solar because, it takes 47 years to pay for it, and I won't be around into 47 years. So solar has to be something that we, as a governmental body, start to look at how it becomes a necessity to have, and then we can combat the kind of energy that PG&E uses. The other aspect is that we as people are dependent upon this light system and this computer, and so we need this energy. This is what we live off of, and I do a lot of work out on the land, and then my grandkids don't want to come out there because there's not going to be any internet, no Wi-Fi. It's like, no, I personally grew up for 18 years without electricity, and so I know how to live without electricity. And I think that we as people need to remember that we can live without electricity. And so, this is not, I blame PG&E, but because they do have a big responsibility that they're not taking to take care of things. But at the same time, we as people have a responsibility to be able to say that, just because this is what we we want or need. We can't always have it, and we need to be prepared not to have it. Last but not least is when some of the discussion, I know the creek fire down here, pretty much $500 million, and I heard this term by Faye a few times, how many billions of dollars being spent. If we were to spend, 10% of that 500 million, 50 million, we would have never had the problem that we had with the creek fire being the largest fire, single fire in California history, or the amount of 16,000 homes being, vanquished in Paradise. If they would take some of that money that they're spent on it to use to take care of the land. And so, that's a great question that Will brought up there, and is that, politically, we need to start addressing this with the right mindset.
Can I just say, actually, I take back my past just for very momentarily. I just hearing all the different panelists respond, I think it's just really important to keep in mind something that that Zan said, which is that it's, yes, private corporations like PG&E are going to need to do things that are different in order to address these challenges, but also public sector entities are going to need to do things different too. And in fact, we all are, because we are in a new era of climate change related risks, and it's going to require many, many different sectors, people, countries, levels of government to do things in a way that's fundamentally different if we're going to address the challenge that we're facing. And we're going to need to look at ways of mitigating risk. We're going to need to look at ways of adapting. It's probably going to feel uncomfortable, but if we, want to continue to safely inhabit our communities, we are going to need to be doing things differently. So I'll just stop there.
Yes, we talked about this a lot in our pre-panel call in terms of the levels of regulations, the levels of public entities, the level of agencies. And Ron had this great moment where he's like, it's not public policy, it's philosophy. It's the way that we relate to each other and to the land. It's a whole way of rethinking about who we are, that we're not the center of the universe, us humans, that we really need to think about us as part of the larger whole. And didn't mean to zoom out so quickly, but I just had to put that in there. So some of the more larger questions that we were talking about too, Sarah, if you wanted to come back to some of the things that you wanted to talk about in terms of who, how, and what.
Faye, it's Ron.
Oh, yes. Hi, Ron.
Just one little, I wanted to touch on that prescribed fire. There was a gentleman or someone, I can't read it real good, asked about, the responsibility of the township in making sure that prescribed fire is put out there. I just completed our first annual cultural burn with the tribe. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that no matter what kind of burn you're doing, control burn, prescribed fire, cultural burn, that doesn't stop a wildfire, but it can make the area to where you might be able to control it. Depends on the type of fire that you're putting on. And so as a township, you need to be involved and not just allow an agency, whether it's CAL FIRE or Forest Service or county or whomever, because you hear the word prescribed fire. You have to understand that when agencies do fire, they do fire because they have a certain agenda, and they're trying to establish that agenda. They're not trying to establish a healthy forest. They're not trying to exactly stop wildfires, they're trying to reduce the fuel load so that wildfires are not so severe. So in other words, it's not really designed to stop fires. The fire will still come through, and so you as a community, any community, I mean, I look at my own communities here that are not really taking care of their land, and even though fires have threatened them time and time again, I had understood that even Paradise had been threatened 2 or 3 times before, and then it finally came through. So this is just a cautionary type of a comment that, make sure you know if you are getting prescribed fire and whom you're working with, what they're doing and why.
Kevin, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and Ron is completely correct. We had multiple fires that had surrounded the town in the past, and none of them had got into kind of our buffer zone that really got into town. There was one in 08 that burned kind of the bottom of town, but nothing that had what we called crossed the Canyon River, which is the Feather River there. This one blew through so fast we didn't even know where it was until it was in town. But you're exactly right. My previous job, I was with the irrigation district here in Paradise, and we own quite a few lands up in the Upper Ridge area, and we did have a forest management plan. We had the ability to go through with grant funding and with the help of the Fire Safe Council here and do thinning and underbrush and not to the prescribed burns, because those were still kind of not really being done up here at that point in time. But I can tell you that that's where the fire stopped. That's where they were able to get control of the fire, and it actually never crested into our watershed, which was a huge benefit because of the water quality issues that fire brings upon all the other damage that goes upon that. So there was one success there, but you could walk through that forest, and that fire went through that forest, and it definitely, it wasn't, we were stopping it, but it was, you could see where it was not able to crest into the trees. It wasn't able to develop that fuel load to keep that, the heat moving forward, where the fire side of things, they were able to create a buffer zone and to stop it. So I agree completely, and we actually have visual evidence that it works.
That's great. That's great. So I guess the underlying sort of subtext this entire conversation is, should we rebuild? Where and how? It's very difficult for all of us to kind of like evaluate who and where. Maybe we can talk about how. Like, what are the ways, or what are the things we need to think about in terms of rebuilding? How do we think about the children and the families? There was an earlier question about as a result of the rebuilding of Paradise, did the rebuilding of the schools become a priority? And how has the rebuilding of the schools sort of strengthened the community in Paradise? Kevin?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, there was a lot of rallying around the schools, and I think you saw that in the documentary. Michelle was such a great leader during that time, and the resiliency of the children to be moved from one location into an old building in Chico. But the key that we always heard from them was that they were together, and that they had this joy. I mean, we all remember our high school. We all remember our mascot, and Paradise Strong was such a key factor to really keeping those groups of kids together. So opening up the schools, and the big thing too is the high school was saved and the middle school was saved, which became the elementary school. And so getting those kids back up to campus was a key factor for healing, not only for those kids, but for the town, and the pride that the town took to be able to get them back up there into a safe manner, and to getting the trees down, or the threats of trees to get down, so that they could have their graduation. was such a huge factor. And it was almost like a spark plug for the town. Like, we're going to do this. We're going to look at what we already did, and we're going to move this forward. And so, yeah, the schools have been a key factor, opening them up. And the other thing too is, and thank God, they were very well insured. And so they're taking that insurance money and reinvesting that back into their current campuses to make them, nice. They're building a brand new gymnasium. They're getting the most, the highest tech type of classrooms moving forward. So there is a real big push to get these schools open, to really give these kids a sense of pride that their schools are the top notch in the area. And then from my perspective as a town manager, it's just a great resource to be able to attract new families up and to say, look at all the resources that we have up here. Yes, we had this disaster, but look what came out of this disaster. And the kids up there are just so resilient. I think one of the questions was, are they more able to adapt to the COVID, work, homeschool? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. They're so adaptable. They're so resourceful, and the teachers are too. That they know how to handle disasters. They know how to ebb and flow with things. So when they were told that on March whatever date they were going to go home and they're going to have homeschool, they were ready to go. Let's do this. We're resilient, but we're ready to bring back those kids as soon as we can back into the classrooms.
I mean, that's just a great story, because I'm thinking about San Francisco's recovery or adaptation or resilience in the under COVID. And what if we had oriented ourselves on recovery and rebuilding, and maybe rebuilding our community on our children and our families? What if we had centered our COVID response on putting schools back online? Would have that sort of rallied us together and unified us as a city in the same way that Paradise did with your schools, and centering children and families in the beginning, at the center, at the top, at the start? Maybe that's a lesson for all of us. It's not, maybe the question is not who decides or where or which community. It's really about how and why.
If I could just jump in and say that for me, making this film was such an incredible experience on so many levels. I think the thing I treasure the most is having gotten to know a community, a small community. I live in New York City, so I live in a place more like San Francisco or Oakland, where you don't really think about, kind of like, well, what binds us all together all the time? But by going to a town and seeing what they did and learning how they responded and how they, you can call it rebuilding, but how they recovered in a way, which isn't just about rebuilding houses and buildings, but is also about rebuilding your heart and your connections and the strength of the society. That is really, that micro story is, to me, very much a lesson that we can take to the macro level. And when we talk about rebuilding back, maybe we can concentrate a little bit less on, is there going to be this kind of housing? And we can think a little bit more about, do we want to rebuild ourselves into stewards of the land? Do we want to rebuild ourselves into stewards for each other?
Yes, perfect. So we have a few more minutes, closing remarks from Sarah and Ron.
I guess I would just say a couple of things. I really, again, appreciate the discussion and getting to be in conversation about this film and about what's happening in Paradise. I feel like there's a lot to learn, and it's a really rich discussion. The piece about the schools reminded me of something that I learned from somebody who's, she was really involved in rebuilding after Katrina in New Orleans, and a woman named Lori Johnson, and she studied earthquake recovery and disaster recovery kind of internationally. She talks about something called the Golden Triangle, where it's schools, jobs, and homes. And if you have 2 out of the 3 people can stay and rebuild, but with just one without the other 2, things start to break apart. So it's just something to think about. I found that really interesting, like the centering around the schools as being so critical in Paradise as a way to just like anchor the community as you know, one piece, and then of course homes being another, and jobs. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, Faye, you brought up the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, and I think that's an important thing for us to think about, because the reason that low income Black families ended up settling there in part is because of I mean, I'm not like an expert on New Orleans, but what I understand is like the land there is more dangerous. So you people who have less choices end up in areas that are more vulnerable. And so when bad things happen in those places based on climate change or other disasters, it's really, really tricky, because it's like that is the home of that community, but it's also a dangerous place. And so how do you think about those two things in tension? How do you create community and protect community while also not putting people in the same dangerous situation again and again and again? And that's like a deep conundrum that I don't think as a society we've figured out.
Perfect. Ron, bring us home, Ron.
Yeah, so I'm listening to everything that's being said, and I think we just have to remember that we're a community, and that means that everybody, is a part of that, and everybody has a responsibility, but everybody also has a connection to each other. And that connection also extends to the land, it extends to the animals, it extends to the plants, it extends to the trees, that they too are part of the community, and they too are connected. And so we need to make sure that, you got to think back in time when the settlers first came. One of the first things that they always did was they built the barn before they built the house. And then they made sure that, the area where they were planting and where they were, putting their homes, that their landscape was the way they wanted it. And then they built their home. And so it's like what I just said earlier when I started with the Native American folks. They always ensured that where they were going to set themselves down, that their environment was conducive to them being able to live out there for 10,000 years. And that's how we have to be thinking in terms of where we're going forward. There's no reason why we can't rebuild where you've been. When you get out in the mountains, almost every home out there is built pretty much near an old Indian site, because the Indians love that spot, and it's a great spot. So why shouldn't you build there, in a sense? And that's what you got to think about. How long have people been living on the land, and how long that we will continue to live on this land if we take care of it right.
Thank you, Ron. So we approach rebuilding or restoration based on what the environment is telling us, and we make sure that we're a part of that environment. Any last thoughts from anyone?
I'll just chime in and say thank you, Faye, for having us. And I just want to say thank you to Zan and Ron Howard and the film crew for them telling our story and just telling it so well, and bringing Paradise to the big screen and to everybody's life. I just really I don't think we can thank you enough on how accurately and how passionately you told the story and how well it was done. And I just want to invite you back in a couple years to have the story of Paradise rebuilt, to look at all the successes that we've had, and that we can be maybe that glowing, shining beacon on the hill that shows how to rebuild after disaster, taking in all of the knowledge that we're gaining through this. We're not taking it lightly by any stretch. We have a very passionate team here at the town. We have a very passionate citizen population here that is looking to be successful at the end of this. So thank you all, and we hope to be that success that you guys can look to into the near future.
Thank you, Kevin. And I just also want to echo what all of you all have been saying. It's such an honor to be on this panel, and this discussion, the level of this discussion has been incredible to be a part of, and to learn from all of you. I wish we could have a wildfire summit all together. And the last thing I would say is thank you to the state of California, because I have really fallen in love with you guys, and I will always come back to Paradise.
All right, thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to Sarah, Ron, Kevin, and San. I'm going to do an outro right now. If you'd like to learn more about the rebuilding of Paradise, or contribute to the Rebuilding Fund, or learn more about any of the organizations that were represented today, please take a look at all the links in the chat. And we've been running the banners with all those with all that information. The upcoming events, a lot of upcoming events. Join us later today at 4:30 p.m. PST for Let's Make Civic Love. You'll get a chance to ask a stranger 36 questions in Zoom breakout rooms, and you can still sign up. The link to register is in the chat. Then come back at 6:30 p.m. today for a second event called People-Led Solutions, Models for a Shared Future. It's moderated by Jessica Prado, whom you met on Valentine's Day. And during this panel, we will also be practicing caring for each other by assembling care packages and writing love notes that'll be distributed to our unhoused neighbors in the East Bay and Chicago. So I'm going to hand it over to Crystal for a bit.
Please take a moment to fill out our survey that's also in the chat. It really helps us understand who we're reaching and how we can make sure to be serving our diverse and wonderful audiences. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please follow us on social media and give us a shout out. We're at SF Urban Film Fest on everything. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you this afternoon.